welcome back to the Mother Flutter podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Sawakis, and I just spent about an hour trying to figure out why my microphone was so quiet. And I can't tell you exactly what the problem was, but I figured it out. I figured it out with Google and AI answers and something in the audio settings. Okay, that's not the point. Today, I want to talk about telepathy, and more specifically about the Telepathy Tapes podcast created by Kai Dickens. And it does feel a little weird to be recording a podcast about a podcast, but I don't care. I am weird, and here we are. So if you haven't listened to the Telepathy Tapes yet, first of all, do that. It's going to blow your mind. It will make you laugh. It will make you cry. It will make you question everything. So all my favorite things, really. But to kind of sum it up, it's basically this beautifully done series that interviews parents and children who are nonverbal autistic, kids and some adults, I assume, and their parents, their teachers, their, school aides, school administrators, physicists, scientists, psychologists, and basically they have proven telepathy, which if you're like me, you're kind of like, well, duh. Because women, we've been doing this with our girlfriends forever, where we can, look at each other from across the room at a party, and it's just the millimeter of your eyeball moves, and you send a clear message that, you and your friend have to boot, scoot, and boogie, and something just changed and the party's over. So I'm not saying I'm telepathic in this psychic kind of a way, but I think that reading energy and the way that they describe telepathy is it's not necessarily, I think that the one metaphor they used that really resonated was like Christmas. When a telepathic message is sent, it is beyond the word Christmas. It is the tree, it's the lights, it's the smell, it's the, sound of bells, etc., etc. It's like an experience. It's an energy, a vibration. And I think that we're doing that with each other all the time. I think something like 90% of communication is nonverbal. So I'm just so excited about this podcast because I think that it's happening all around us, and they've really kind of proven it in a way that is very hard for skeptics to ignore. So this isn't like telepathy in the sense of, a neon sign, and a psychic charging for readings. It's really hard to deny with the research and the experts that have been looking at this stuff for decades and who have, the traditional credentials, and they've done these, I think they call them double-blind studies, which is like the top tier of studies where you're, trying to prove things. And there's just so many things about this that I kind of want to dive into here. So, number one, I think that let me see. Let me look at my notes here. So, yeah, women, I feel like we do have this kind of intuitive ability. And apparently nonverbal autistic kids do as well, which when you start listening to these tapes in this podcast series, you'll see why. But there's a few things that I kind of thought were interesting in terms of this particular demographic of nonverbal people on the autism spectrum. What is wild about this whole thing too is that a lot of these particular individuals have been demonized. That's an extreme word, but pathologized. And the parents, were told, like, hey, sorry, there's nothing in there as far as your kid goes. And, your kid's kind of a lost cause, even though the parents knew in the way that a parent is connected to their child, like a baby grows inside of, its mother for almost a year. So that is a, you might say psychic or telepathic, connection, just by way of the baby's entire existence comes from the mother's cells and what she eats, and she grows this human inside her. So I feel like that already kind of creates a sort of psychic connection. And so these mothers are fighting for their kids. No, I know there's more in there, and being told, no, this is an empty shell, which is really sad, because this series tells us, meanwhile, whoops-a-daisy, we're completely wrong, and this kid is like, these kids are literal savants and telepathically communicating in these cases with people in other countries, and just trying to spread this message of like love and kindness and compassion. Meanwhile, our quote unquote experts are, calling them a lost cause, which is just absolutely infuriating. And you have to wonder how often this is happening with other, diagnoses and things that are pathologized, like schizophrenia. Now, I don't have the answers there, but what if there's just way more to these things than we think, and we are just writing off hordes of people as crazy or dumb or, whatever. It reminds me of like, I dated briefly this French guy in college, and we remained friends for several years, and he had very limited English when we met. And then I saw him, and I met up with him like 5 years later, and I was like, holy shit, because his English improved just like exponentially. And I knew he was smart. He was a really, really talented musician and was studying aerospace engineering. But it was just so crazy to like communicate with him, with his, how he had grown using the English language. And not to say that I thought he was stupid, but he was just, only capable at that time of communicating like more simple ideas, because he had a limited understanding of the English language, or a limited grasp. Here I was like failing French and could barely communicate in French with him. So, it reminds me of kind of that concept of, people who don't speak the language, like they're not stupid. In fact, they probably know more languages than you. It's just, there's different ways to communicate. So, just wild. And, I say that like these experts, called these kids, lost causes. And that's a whole other thing, is many of them are extremely, intelligent, extremely high IQs, like literal savants in math or language, et cetera, and have been put in like first to third grade level courses in school, which is just absolutely devastating. And also happens with English language learners in this country. I work in ed tech, and I have talked to, directors and administrators who know that this happens with kids who are, put in like even special ed because they, don't fully have that grasp on the English language yet. And so they're not dumb, but we are essentially holding them back because I guess, that's our fault for not figuring out a way to adequately communicate and like give more options for communicating beyond just the traditional ways that we do it. So there's a lot of controversy, unfortunately, about what they call spelling. And spelling is basically how these nonverbal autistic kids have been able to communicate, which is using an iPad and a typewriter. And because in a lot of these cases, their particular diagnosis or whatever you want to call it also means that their physical control over their bodies can be a challenge. So there is like an aid to kind of help them do the typing in some cases. And that's not to say that this person is doing the communicating, but they are kind of helping guide their hands. And so there's a woman who, she's a psychologist, and she actually published a book about telepathy and nonverbal autistic kids, and I believe spelling in it. And they talk about how she loses her license to practice because of this, which is just absolutely insane, And so I know that there's an organization. I feel like I wrote this down. No, I didn't. So there's an organization that basically like kind of controls all the who's its and what's its of like a lot of different special needs and speech and aids and whatever. And they basically discredited spelling. And the way that they wrap it up in this episode is to say that there was a nonverbal autistic child who spelled out that I believe a caretaker was sexually abusing them. And then all of a sudden, spelling is discredited as a practice because it was found to be quote unquote untrue, which is very, very, very common when kids or adults come out about childhood sexual abuse. I know because it happened to me. Most adults can't fathom how often this happens, and by people who they also trust, that instead of dealing with it and, taking the necessary action to remedy it, they decide to call the accuser crazy and will make the victim essentially at fault. And unfortunately, most adults would rather take that route and live in denial than actually face the facts that there are child abusers among us. And usually, statistically, a child is more likely to be sexually abused by a family member or a close family friend than a stranger. And so I didn't look into this case this particular case and how they decided it was quote unquote not true. How could you take proper evidence from a nonverbal child? Was this child threatened? This is obviously a very, very, very vulnerable person. Were they threatened? There's just so much to go into it, but there's so much to it. And, I can guarantee that case, could be reopened, but it's just so sad. It's just so sad that they would discredit this, because essentially somebody didn't like the truth. And I say the truth because it's very rare for a child to come out about sexual abuse and lie. And yet we hear that as if that's normal, but there's no reason for a child to lie about that. There's nothing to gain from that, or an adult. There's nothing to gain from that other than sharing the truth and trying to protect other children from becoming victims as well. And I really, if you look into the statistics, it just plays out like this over and over and over and over again, where the victim tries to come out, and it's actually often more traumatizing to come out about the abuse than the actual abuse. So anyways, all this to say, this one case, they discredit this thing called spelling, where these nonverbal autistic kids are able to actually communicate, using an iPad and a keyboard and a little bit of help. And that's another thing. If they're saying like the aid, helped the kid lie about abuse, what does the aid have to gain? So that aside, I was thinking, like, what is it about these people that would allow them to have the access to these gifts, these, telepathic gifts, and specifically why does it seem to be so strong in these nonverbal autistic people? And, number one, they don't have traditional schooling, which, again, I work in the education space and have on and off for a long time. And the system is broken, and everybody who works in it knows it. And that's because it was, it's being designed by people who aren't working with kids. And, in many cases, it gets bought out by people with, special interests, not the autistic kind, like more the profit kind, and our history is manipulated and altered. And, each year it gets more and more rigid, it seems, with, these arbitrary tests that the whole freaking year seems to be focused on, with skills that ultimately, computers are doing. And it's just crazy. And, I'm not saying that I have the solution, but back to my point. What is it about these people? They don't have traditional schooling, right? They're sitting in a classroom, in many cases, geniuses, getting a first and third grade education. So they're able to kind of zone out, do their own thing, think about other things. They don't have traditional relationships or career. So they're totally outside the mainstream and all of the kind of messaging and indoctrination that comes with, and brainwashing that comes with these traditional structures that we spend a majority of our time in, like school and 9-to-5 jobs, and just the whole get married, have kids. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong inherently with any of those things, but they are kind of skipping past or, sneaking through these mainstream ways of doing things, which is interesting. I will say trauma, and, in one woman in the series words, they're imprisoned in many senses. Imprisoned in the sense that, right, if spelling isn't considered like legitimate, many of them are not, allowed to communicate, or they don't have a good way to communicate with their peers or their family, etc. And then also, as I mentioned, a lot of them struggle with what do you call it? Like body autonomy? No, like body control, like motor control, and controlling their physical bodies and their, the whether it's like the noises they make or just like, their physical movements. There's a struggle with controlling those. And I feel like just the trauma of all of that kind of like cracks you open for sure. I love this term that I've heard called, people call post-traumatic stress. They call it post-traumatic growth, because it, if you're lucky enough to make it through, it can really be a gift, in terms of like hypervigilance and noticing things that people don't notice, and noticing, patterns and making connections, and, your intuition gets really, really sharp. Your sense of humor will often improve. Just, I think something in your brain kind of breaks at a certain point, and you kind of use humor to survive. And I do think that something about like heavy trauma can really crack people open. And, that's why I think a lot of like the greatest artists have like been through some real shit in their lives. And all this to say, like, if you're listening and you're either going through some real shit or you've been through some real shit and you're kind of sludging through it. I don't know if sludging's a word, but we're going to go with it. Like if you can come out the other side and, get the help you need, whether it's like therapy or community or 12-step or equine therapy or, psychedelic assisted therapy with professionals, etc. I just think that it can really, it can be a gift. And that's not to say that like go traumatize your kids so that they'll be funny and intuitive. Don't do that. They'll probably be funny and intuitive anyways. But post-traumatic growth. And so I do wonder if that has something to do with it. And also just like the necessity of like needing some way to communicate. And, like I mentioned in the beginning of this episode, like, women kind of, we do this with each other. Like we'll just give each other a look and say something, or, hey, I was thinking about you. Like, are you okay? Or I had a dream about you. Oh, like actually that's funny because I have been, going through this, or, hey, how long have you been, sleeping with your ex, oh, damn it. How'd you know? Like we do this with each other. I think that goes back to like the whole we're able to make people thing. I think it gives us really sharp intuition and like a knowing. And I'm not going to hang, psychic sign in my window, neon psychic sign yet. I do have an entrepreneurial spirit though. I do. And I have been asked for some readings before. I've given some good ones. But, I also don't want to like write off the neon sign people, because maybe some of them are telling the truth, like I've met a woman who was a non-traditional healer, she actually died. She died for a couple of minutes, came back to life. And when I met her to do this like healing session, she started telling me things that there would be no way for her to know about me. She started telling me things and I started crying within like the first couple minutes of meeting her. And she's like, this usually happens. So I think this is happening. I mean, I know this is happening. It exists in our world. And basically the telepathy tapes proves it in a way that we have these traditional experts on board that, go to Harvard and they work with NASA and blah, blah, blah. And so they can, put their stamp on it for all the people who need those credentials to validate something. And I'm really excited about that because there's a lot of people who want those credentials to believe. And I get it. I get it. I like them too. I like being able to say, hey, go check this out. They got mad credentials, but I don't need them. I know. I trust my knowing for the most part, but I like to question it too. It's good to question it. But I think we also question our, just this past weekend, I did something. I went against my gut. And the universe definitely got jostled around a little bit for that. But that's okay. Live and learn again. Every time I do it, I get beat up a little bit. But trust your gut, folks. Trust your gut. Okay. So yeah, this feels big. I'm excited. Listen to this podcast series. They're making a documentary, which I'm super, super, super excited about. And you all know I am obsessed with digging into what really freaking happened during, the witch burnings, which was, if you have not listened to this podcast or you have not met me, way beyond just what happened in Salem. Okay. It was like hundreds of thousands of people in Europe. We don't know the real numbers. Records get destroyed today. They were destroyed then. But check out Witches of Scotland podcast, who, do find some remaining records and go into what actually happened. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because a lot of the people who were burned and executed for being quote unquote witches were, people with disabilities, and, people who were different, and they were targeted. And maybe, some of them were gifted. Like, think about how dangerous telepathy is for corruption and for corrupt leaders, because these people are able to see right through the bullshit, Of course you wouldn't want them. Of course you wouldn't want them on your radar. Of course you'd want to discredit them. And, a lot of the messages from these nonverbal autistic kids is that they are spreading, messages of like connecting to one loving consciousness, which you hear in a lot of like spiritual teachings, and which, a lot of people tap into when they do therapeutic psychedelic experiences, or, whatever, therapeutic psychedelics. And yeah, they're spreading messages of like healing and loving each other. And, that doesn't really jive with a system that profits off of us being sick and tired and scared. Not so profitable to be loving, kind, and compassionate. So yeah, I think that this is an example where the witch burnings are still, playing out today. And, we have these literal geniuses who can communicate telepathically with insane accuracy. And, many of them are being oppressed. And their parents, have been told there's nothing in there. Your kid's a lost cause. And meanwhile, they are literal savants, and then put in classes where they're learning like, colors in the alphabet. which is absolute insanity. So, yeah, I'm really excited about this. I'm really excited that people are talking about this and that it is out there. And I can't wait for the documentary. And I can't recommend this series enough. And I just think there's so much more here than we give credit to, we've been kind of conditioned to believe in like a material world that is like, if you can see it, taste it, touch it, feel it, it's real. And if you can't, then it's not. And I just think that is just only scratching the surface. And there's just so much more here that we don't understand fully yet. But that doesn't mean it's not real. So, boy, this was a little heavier than I thought it would be, but thanks for listening if you're with me. And yeah, it's good to be back chatting into a microphone, into the ether again. It's what I do best. Okay. I love you. I hope you have a wonderful day. And until next time, this has been Mother Flutter.